Everyone, welcome. Thanks for joining us for our Rockin Pop-Up with the Santa Cruz Museum of Natural History. My name is Marisa Gomez. I'm our Public Programs Manager. And today we're really excited to have a special guest with us in addition to our regular stars of the show, the Geology Gents, Gavin and Graham. And we just want to acknowledge that our community has been going through quite a set of hurdles recently. Namely the CZU lightning complex, which is still impacting the Santa Cruz Mountains here. But also evacuation orders have started to lift. And so people are, some people are able to go home, even though many still are waiting. And we have started to reflect on, what that landscape is going to be looking for the people who do go home now that the fire's getting a little bit more under control. And in addition to, noting impacts that it's had on our roads, utilities, obviously our forests, our trees, plants. We're also going to see a lot of impacts on the geology of the region and on, the earth itself, the soil. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. And we hope you are all well and that this is a nice reprieve for you today. So without further ado, I'm going to bring in Gavin and Graham so that they can give us a little bit more deets on what's going on today.
Thanks, Marisa. So yeah, as you said, we've had some fires going through the area, and we touched upon it a little bit in our last Rockin Pop-Up that fires like this can have a huge impact on the Earth itself, and they cause some cascading effects in the Earth system. But I think that I'm pretty excited to look at the nitty-gritty of it all. Like, let's look right into the specific area, and let's look at the geosphere and the biosphere and the hydrosphere all together. How does that sound, Graham?
That sounds great. Yeah, when fires hit the landscapes, they change all these things. They interact with the life there, they interact with the earth there, and they interact with the waters there. And so here, today, we have a specialist on all this good stuff, Alandra Lopez. Hi, Alandra.
Hi, Graham, Gavin, and Marisa.
So we've got some questions for you to sort of dive into understanding how fire affects landscapes. But in tradition, as Gavin and I have done in interviews here before, we want to know, of all the scientists we meet, how did you become a scientist? What sort of brought you into becoming a geoscientist?
I'm going to share my screen because I think that will help. Let me just start this. So you can see these photos, right?
Yep.
Yes.
So I grew up in a rural Massachusetts. I spent a lot of time outdoors, particularly playing in the woods in our backyard. And I quickly became fascinated in doing experiments and especially learning more about the environment once I hit middle and high school. And so I ended up going to college in coastal Maine, which is shown in these photos, to learn more about chemistry and earth science. And something that really inspired me as I was thinking about what I wanted to do after college was things happening in the community surrounding my home in Massachusetts. So a lot of the environment there is contaminated because of how industry historically disposed of waste. And so that was really interesting to me, especially thinking about ways that the environment either filters out those contaminants or releases them into community resources that we use. So things like our drinking water or just our aquatic systems in general, so fish and wildlife. So these photos are different areas across coastal Maine that I explored while at Bowdoin, and something that might stand out compared to coastal California is that this area is really rocky, which which definitely connects to what you guys talk about usually. So this tells a lot of like amazing information about plate tectonics, but I've kind of transitioned into thinking more about soils.
It's really interesting. So this is something we haven't really talked about too much in the Rockin Pop-Up, in the series of online Rockin Pop-Ups, but I think that there's a really big contingency of geologists who get into it, or of people in the earth sciences, I should say, who get into it because they start off just liking the earth, like maybe me and Graham have described, but realize that they can figure out the like ways to better understand humans' impact on the environment and sort of the ripple effects from that. So that's really interesting, and that's real. A lot of earth scientists are interested in those sorts of questions. So that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that's a great springboard into our next question. So you talked about, how the sort of your journey to becoming a geoscientist and becoming, studying contaminants in natural systems. But could you dive in a little bit deeper into what you do as a scientist now, what your research is?
Yeah, so what I do, so I'm currently a Ph.D. Candidate at Stanford. I'm working in a lab looking at soil biogeochemistry. I am still fascinated by contaminants, so that has definitely brought me into continuing doing research in this field. But I've shifted the type of contaminants that I'm looking at and have focused more on the contaminants that are naturally present in our environment, in the Earth system. So these are things that are present in rocks that somehow get released and end up contaminating water, for example. So I look at contaminants like arsenic, uranium, and chromium. And I want to understand how they affect our water quality, looking primarily at groundwater. So this bottom picture is a groundwater pump, an example of what you might find in a farm in the Central Valley. And then this is me collecting soil samples deep in the ground in order to understand what's happening in the soil that can release these contaminants that affect the water that we're drinking. And this depends a lot on those rocks and minerals. And I'll use the word soil biogeochemistry, which again gets at the biological, geologic, and chemical processes happening. So I'll also note that this large pole is actually right here in this photo. So we're collecting soils really deep in the ground. And that helps us better understand why we're getting certain amounts of these contaminants that are toxic to us in our waters.
That's really cool. And I'm glad you made the distinction of these being natural contaminants, because I think that's something that may not be really abundantly clear to the lay person, is that like not everything that contaminates our drinking water is put there by some irresponsible company years ago. That the interaction between the water system and the soil itself and the rocks that eventually go into making the soil, all sorts of things can go into that water based on those interactions, right? And so you put up a few elements here that might be familiar with our audience, especially uranium, because Graham and I can't stop talking about that, but also arsenic and chromium. These are things you don't want in your water, but they sometimes just get there because of the environment itself.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And so one thing, so you study soils and how contaminants are going through soils, but this is something that even still for me, for all the time I've spent thinking about geology, it's still like I don't understand very well and always want to understand a little bit better. Can you please tell us how soils form? We often see rocks and then we see soils, and we know they're related somehow, but there's something that to me is magic that happens between rock and the soil. Could you help us dig into it a little more?
Yeah, so it gets at that word biogeochemistry again. So like you said, you think about rocks when you think about how soils form originally, and that's really the starting life of a soil, is usually the breakup of a rock and then things acting on that. So when you think about soil science, there's four major processes that affect the soil and create it. And then there are factors that govern those processes happening. So I've written them up here, and these are really helpful when you go out into the environment and dig a soil pit and look at it. You can start to think, okay, what climate is this soil in? Is it on a hill slope, or is it at the bottom of a hill? What type of organisms are present in it? Are there a lot of worms mixing things around? And how long has this soil been around for? So time's a big thing, but there's also a lot of other things acting on it. Parent material, rocks are big parent material, so what soil is derived from. And then the processes that then turn rock and the parent material into soil are things like mixing. So physically mixing the soil around will definitely change and age that soil. There are transformations. So minerals, rocks can transform over time. There are chemical changes that can happen in the soil. And then things called gains and losses are, say you have a landslide and that moves a lot of soil down slope. That area that received all that soil now has all of this new parent material to continue developing that soil. So you can see over time, losses again being that area that lost all that soil from the landslide. That can affect the development later on. But this just shows like over time, you're getting a much more complex soil system developing because of all these different factors, which play together on the soils too. I also put in an actual example of a soil profile. So when you dig deep into the soil, this young soil is predominantly rocky or made up of rocks broken into smaller pieces, so more unconsolidated materials. And then you get some darkness near the top of your soil, which is related to organic matter and plants growing too. But then you can look and see there are tons of different soil orders and soil profiles that you can look at online, where you get a lot more horizons forming. So each of these layers we call different horizons in the soil profile, and they're either accumulating or getting rid of different, moving different things within the soil related to these processes.
That's really interesting, Alandra, and thank you for that, because I had also just treated soil as a black box and be like, oh, it's not rocks. But there are a few things that catch me as really cool about this. The first thing is that because there are so many factors that go into creating a soil, it seems as though soils are very location specific, and so you can get you can walk a mile and be in a totally different soil. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. Especially even when you walk and dig a hole at the top of a hill, and then you walk 100 feet to the bottom of the hill and compare the soil, it's going to look a lot different. You might find it's harder to dig into the soil at the bottom of the hill because there's a lot of things moving and settling down there. So things like clay, that's hard to get through. You might not find as much of that at the top of the hill. So they both develop very differently.
That's cool. And I have to say, there are different scales to this, and not to go on too much of a tangent, but it's just interesting to think about the Great Plains, for instance, and how those soils are all fertile, but then you get to more rockier places and there are reasons why people farm on certain soils and other places not, right?
Yeah.
And it's got to do with the geology mostly in that case?
So in that case, it's geology, but it also depends a lot on things like climate, the biology within the soil. So for example, with climate, if you're in an arid environment, you're gonna develop your soil a lot slower than if you're in a tropical environment where you get a lot of rain and potentially transformations happening within your soil.
Got it. And so what you're saying is that, really soil formation is dependent on all three of the thing, or what I assume is three things that go into it. It's like your rocks, your biota, and probably some water somewhere in there, and then these processes that you described kind of mix them all together.
Yeah, so these all play large roles in developing soils, definitely.
Interesting. Okay, so now that we kind of know the deal in terms of general soils, I think that we should take it back closer to home, and something that the audience just loves to ask the Geology Gents over the years has been about serpentine soils. So can you tell us, what are serpentine soils? Why are they special? And maybe like, why do they happen around here? Because they seem like a really, really special thing about the place we live in. So can you go over that?
Yeah, so serpentine soils are really described as any soil derived from what's called ultramafic rock or serpentinite. And these, again, are the soil's parent material as it's developing. So a lot of serpentinite is found along coastlines. So serpentinite occurs, I think, like around, it covers like 1% of the total Earth's surface. And this is predominantly along coastlines, and that's because these rocks form as tectonic plates collide. So these are at convergent plate boundaries, and you'll see, so these are serpentinite outcrops across the globe looking at a polar projection. And then this is a zoomed in plate tectonic map of the North American plate, and we can see along these convergent plate boundaries, or what historically were convergent plate boundaries, we see ultramafic rocks, so serpentinite popping up at the Earth's surface. And
yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to say that we've plugged this in some Rockin Pop-Up, so the audience might be privy to some of this, but you had mentioned ultramafic rocks, and I just wanted to clear that up for folks who may be unfamiliar. But we think of these as, we think of serpentinite happening from basically the basaltic ocean crust. So you get this young ocean crust, it moves, it interacts with a convergent plate boundary, and at that boundary you get a bunch of salty ocean water being pumped into it, and it's a metamorphic process to make these serpentinites. Is that right?
Yeah.
You say that that's a good way of describing it?
And a kind of a cool thing, I like how you mentioned that there's like serpentine soils formed from both serpentinite rock itself as well as its other ultramafic relatives. And so sometimes, like what we have along coastlines is we'll have these sort of complexes of rock that are sort of ripped up from the bottom of the ocean crust while you have subduction going on. So there's things like basalt, things like serpentine, things that are like mantle rock getting caught up and mixed in there. So you get this whole kind of awesome geologic, ultramafic, low silica, high iron smorgasbord of rocks that can kind of go into here. So yeah, I am wowed, and my mind is boggled that a whole 1% of the crust is made up of serpentine soils. That's way more than I ever thought there was.
That is a pretty interesting stat.
Yeah. And I'll add some more comments about serpentine soils and the type of vegetation that grows on them. So serpentine soils are pretty difficult to grow in because they lack a lot of the nutrients that plants need. So these are things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and calcium. So these soils typically have a lot of magnesium in it, which makes it also difficult for plants to take up the calcium that is present in the soil. And to add to nutrient deficiency for plants, there's usually a high amount of toxic elements. So things like chromium, which I mentioned before, nickel, cobalt, and cadmium. So these are some metals. And for me, like I said, chromium is something I'm really interested in, and serpentine soils tend to have high amounts of this chromium. And it's due to the mineralogy. So you can find chromium in serpentine minerals. And so this can then react and form its toxic hexavalent chromium form, which can end up in water and have health effects for humans. But I also show here, so this is some serpentinite up in Sonoma County at Pepperwood Preserve. But I'm showing examples from online of different plants that can grow on serpentine soils. And so these types of plants survive by doing things like hyperaccumulating metals and these toxic species in order to make the soil a little bit more healthy. They also have things like fleshy leaves. They can grow leaf hairs. There's a lot of like furry little leaves on this plant, or change their pigments to be more protective. So they can grow in what looks to be really dry, high light environments that make the plants more susceptible to drying out in this area. And I'll also add, I saw today when I was looking more on these serpentine landscapes that they facilitate the growth of about 13% of the endemic plant species in California, which means that these species are native to California, and they also grow in this very unique environment. So that makes serpentine soils also really important.
Cool. That's really interesting. And I really like the pictures that you have in the backgrounds here, because it really does kind of look like a barren wasteland. Like, to my untrained eye, I wouldn't call any of this soil. It looks just like crushed rock, and there's not that like loamy sort of soil you think about. And so is that just because you have such little vegetation there relative to like a forest or something that you're not driving that process as well in a serpentine soil, and it takes just a longer time to develop a thick soil cap?
So I think it depends again on the soil forming factors that are contributing to this area. I think with the nutrient deficiency that these soils have, it makes it more difficult for more plants to grow in these soils, which makes it more exclusive for these smaller grassy environments. But in a segue to the another topic of this conversation, this photo here was taken after a wildfire in 2019. So this area was also subjected to some pretty quick, low severity burn across it. So that's why you also see on the ground more blackened area, which is sunburned burned grasses. But here you can tell that it didn't burn for very long in this location because there's still plenty of that dried grass there.
Got it. Got it. Awesome. So you hit the nail on the head for segueing to fires, because we were going to go there next. And you specifically study soils and the impacts of fires on the soil system after they burn. And so can you talk a little bit more about the fire's effect on landscape? Like, how does it help with soil development? How does it affect the biota as a whole? And how does it just generally shape a landscape? What have you found?
Yeah, so I initially had talked about how I have most of my research has been focused on how soil contaminants then affect groundwater quality. So this past year, I've spent a lot more time thinking about the potential effects of wildfires on this, because of the frequency of these extreme wildfires that have occurred in the past 5 years across a landscape that has a lot of serpentine geology. And so these photos are all taken in November of 2019 after the Kincaid fire in Sonoma County. And so this gives a kind of array of how fire can affect landscapes. So this is more of a grassland area. And then here at Modini Preserve, you're getting densely vegetated forests being severely burned, where you lose a lot of fuels in that fire. And so when you think about fire, it's an important component to a lot of different ecosystems, and it has a lot of ecological benefits to maintain a healthy environment. However, depending on the severity of the fire, that can be extremely damaging as well to infrastructure, as we had talked about, and also to things like water quality and air quality. And overall, fires do a lot to soil biogeochemistry on the short term and also the long term. So as an example, as we're burning through these landscapes, you might be burning a lot of the grasses or vegetation. You might be burning off organic matter present in the soil, but that might not stay the case in the long term. You might afterwards see a pulse of more organic matter later on. So it depends a lot on the type of fire. So we've heard of things like prescribed and controlled fires versus more extreme wildfires. So that is really dependent on fire type. For soils, also one big thing is the soils after fires become a bit more hydrophobic as well, which means they're water repellent. So when rain comes, you might see a lot of surface runoff of your water, and that might also lead to greater erosion. And especially when you don't have as much vegetation and plants on your soil, that can also enhance the amount of erosion you're getting across landscapes. And then for me, from a soil perspective as well, minerals can change. So at high temperatures, minerals can transform and cause a lot of changes in the type of elements released in your soils. So nutrients can be released because of fires. And you might see changes in colors of your soil from fires. So you might find that your soil is darker now than it was before the fire, or more red. And that as well can be associated with mineral changes.
Wow, that's wild. There's such an interaction between these sort of three: hydrosphere, biosphere, geosphere, and it's like some fires that you say are natural are causing all of these sort of natural cyclicities. And so one of the things I thought was really interesting that you just mentioned is like really a lot of this is controlled by the severity of fires. And I think a lot of what I've heard been talked about, especially in Santa Cruz, given our recent fires, is, how the prescribed burns play a role in this. And are the severity of the fires that we have been seeing in the past 5 years actually what you would expect naturally, or are humans having an effect on the severity itself? What do you think?
Yeah, so I'm learning a lot more about this year, and I think it's really fascinating. So historically in California, fires were a lot more frequent, but caused less disturbance. But then we hit in like the mid 1800s a fire suppression era, which led to more densely vegetated forests across California, which didn't burn as frequently as before, and then can lead to some more severe wildfire situations. And this is also compounded by drought conditions as well, and drying up of these heavy fuel loads in different wildland spaces. So these are, since my work focused in Sonoma County on the Kincaid fire, I found this photo in 2015 from Google Street View of an area that I sampled at after the fire. So this is pre-fire, and you can see there's a lot of dense vegetation of many different sizes. So we have taller trees, and then medium-sized plants, and then more bushes areas. And then after the Kincaid fire passed through, this is what that same location looked like. So this is indicative of a moderate to high severity burned area that isn't necessarily the healthiest for this ecosystem. But when I was out there, one of the research technicians had mentioned, and I'm not a botanist or ecologist, but she had mentioned that at high temperatures, some of these acorns open up. So this can also be signs of new life. And if these survive and turn into seedlings, we might see the regeneration of a new forest, which is really interesting. And I'll also leave this here. So this is a sketch from, I think, late 1800s of what some of the mountain areas in California looked like. And we can see that trees are more sparsely distributed across a landscape, which helps in promoting these like lower disturbance, low severity fires compared to what our forests look like in certain areas now. And then this is just showing before and after doing fuel reduction treatment. So trying to get rid of some of these latter fuels so that we don't have as severe wildfires later on.
Yeah. And I like, or I think that's interesting, that idea of these ladder fuels, right? These sort of medium-sized trees, that if those get to grow up too much, those can be ways for fires to jump from the ground where they're not burning too, they're not burning super hot, they're just sort of clearing out grass and brush, but they can climb these ladders up into higher trees. And that's how we get those much more, dangerous, fast-moving, high-severity fires.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And I'll wrap up the context of where my research fits into thinking about wildfires and fires' effects on soil. So what I do is I'll collect soil after a wildfire and look at how changes in mineralogy occur across depth depending on the different temperatures of the soil during those fires, and then how that has an effect on contaminants. So these are two photos highlighting that wildfires can have pretty important effects on water quality and also our air quality. And especially for water quality too, these can be long lasting. They can extend months later into the rainy season, and then even occur like years later. So there's a lot of changes that fires can have on soils that not only have an effect immediately, but also will continue to change the soil across time.
Awesome. Yeah, glad we have people like you, Alandra, figuring this stuff out. So the geologists are able to understand how these fires are affecting things, even when rocks aren't necessarily the one thing. So that's interesting.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Alandra.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for having me and for wanting to talk more about soils and wildfires. I'm always interested in hearing more about wildfires' effects on ecosystems and the Earth system. So it's really nice to have a conversation about it.
Yeah, well, I learned so much.
Thanks for being with us, Alandra. And I have a couple of thoughts that have come up throughout your presentation, if I could chime in, and just kind of touching on what you just noted about fires on like a larger system. I just wanted to share for our local Santa Cruz people who might be interested in the fire's effects on certain rare plants. I did see recently in a California Native Plant Society forum that it looks like maybe a stand of a rare Santa Cruz cypress tree may have burned during the CZU lightning complex. And that's a particular tree that benefits from fire in terms of new growth, but the trees themselves don't last through the fire. So kind of, we've been talking about redwoods a lot and how the redwoods may be able to withstand that. But there are so many different stories. And even down into the soil, which I'm so glad that we were able to get a little, dig a little deeper into that. And I'm curious about what you were speaking of fire's effect on minerals and then on water quality, and also on waters that come after fires, and so landslides. And back at the beginning of your presentation, you were talking about how landslides have an effect on soil composition too. And so I'm just curious if there's been any studies specifically on that, like nuance between fire that causes landslide and then long-term soil composition that's like based off of that kind of interplay, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think landslides are dependent as well on the topography and the type of rain and precipitation events that occur after wildfires. So in soils when you're burning off organic matter, say, that's affecting the structure of the soil too. So organic matter can clump soil particles together. They're called aggregates. So you can pick up soil and it looks like a ball most of the time. It's not individual soil particles. So a lot of that is being held together by organic matter. So when you lose that or change the organic matter, you can break up the structure of your soil, which destabilizes it in a way. And then in terms of water quality too, when you have fires passing over soils, you release a lot of different nutrients. So you might get pulses in your water of potentially more carbon or nitrogen or things like calcium and sodium and different salts. Or you can also get the release of metals. And these things may be present in the water, or it may be the pushing of a bunch of sediments within that water too, which can cause a lot of different problems with water treatment. So the water, if you look up photos of streams after fires and rain, you might find it's really cloudy because you're pushing a lot more sediments and solid load too into your water, which can have effects.
Yeah. And also, I guess, so you were talking about hexavalent chromium, which I know of because of Aaron Brockovich, which at least the movie, and then also just like the story of that part of like California history. And so I'm just curious, does that mean that like the town of Hinckley was surrounded by serpentine soils? Do you know anything about that?
No, so the Aaron Brockovich case was focused more on industrial sources of it. So that was related to industry and anthropogenic causes. So when we think about hexavalent chromium and its natural occurrence, that's less acute contamination and more widely distributed. So we're thinking of areas in like the Sacramento Valley that receive sediments coming down from the Coast Range Mountains and then affecting their groundwater quality by different natural processes forming hexavalent chromium in the ground. So it's slightly different. And wildfires, we're currently, there's inconclusive like information about how they affect chromium and hexavalent chromium in the environment. And it's something that's really interesting to think about, especially in this area with a lot of serpentine landscape. But this type of hexavalent chromium is not occurring in as high of concentrations in our water as what you might expect as a result of like industrial practices. Yeah.
Well, Gavin and Graham, do you have any more questions that you want to ask Alandra before we get to this week's submissions?
I think that I've learned a ton. I don't have anything else. G, do you?
Me as well. I'm just still reeling from all this new information that I've got. Yeah.
Well, yeah, thanks so much for being with us, Alandra. You can stick around for a couple of submissions too. Maybe you have some insights for them as well. So guys, we got a couple of submissions this time around. I'm gonna start sharing the first one, which is a grouping of a number of rocks. So we've got here this first one. What do you guys see here?
So it seems to me like quartz is the I would call it matrix material, but it's not really like the white stuff in here or the cloudy.
Yeah,
cloudy
that milky, smoky, cloudy looking stuff.
That's right. That just screams quartz to me. It's the green stuff that's really interesting. And Graham, you had a thought on this. What do you think that is?
Yeah, we see green, and it's, there's a lot of kind of funky green minerals out there. One we see around here often is serpentine. And we certainly talked about that plenty today. It's always hard to figure it out just from a picture, but based on sort of how platy that mineral looks, kind of up in the corner where you see a lot more of that green, that looks a little bit to me like the mineral chlorite, which is one I haven't seen a ton out here, at least not in the rocks out here. But it's this kind of flaky, green, kind of glossy, but not too shiny mineral. And that would be my guess, that's the mineral chlorite.
Yeah, and you often see chlorite associated with quartz, whereas, the green rocks we see out here, the serpentinites, the jadites and the nephrites, those are not usually associated with the mineral quartz. And so I really like the idea that this is chlorite. So that'd be the gent's best guess, I think.
Great. What about this one?
This is a beautiful one. It's a pretty nice rock, right, Graham?
Gavin, this rock looks really nice to me. This is a nice rock.
It's a nice rock. It is a piece of gneiss, and sorry that the gents had to make a bad joke there, but it's a piece of gneiss. We've talked about this actually in some of the early Rockin Pop-Ups that were virtual, but it's a really highly metamorphosed rock, and you get these stripes. Those are what we call foliations, and it's when the minerals inside the parent rock start to line up and they start to actually separate based on mineralogy. And so we can even probably say that this started out as a granitic natural the first the protolith. That's it. Thank you, Graham.
I got you. Don't worry.
I forgot the word, but yeah. So the protolith, the rock that was metamorphosed, is probably a granite, just based on the mineralogy in there and kind of the way it looks. Would you agree, Graham?
Definitely. There's those big, chunky, like kind of milky, yellowish minerals in there. Those are going to be quartz and feldspar, and those dark minerals are going to be mostly biotite, maybe a little bit of amphibole in there. But yeah, it's got this second beautiful life as a gneiss after it started out as a granite. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, beautiful.
We got more for you.
Okay, so this one, I really like this submission because it's probably igneous rock, metamorphic rock, and now we've got a sedimentary rock.
Oh, beautiful. I didn't even realize that.
I know. And this is kind of a perplexing one. You get these weird sort of textures in sedimentary rocks, and you always are trying to figure out whether it's a fossil. It could always be a fossil in a sedimentary rock, or if it's a sedimentary feature. And so especially in the top rock here, you get kind of this light brown stuff and this dark gray stuff. And we were debating before this whether these are fossils, but in my opinion, I think that these are actually sedimentary features. A lot of times when you have a mud and you dry the mud, you get these desiccation cracks. We call them mud cracks, aptly named. And then other different types of muds can fill in those cracks. So I think that these are mudstones that have been sort of dry, desiccated, cracked, and then filled in with different sediments. So I think that they're sedimentary features, if I had to guess. But it's always hard to distinguish between these when you don't have the rocks in hand. So we had a couple of guesses, but that's my best guess, I think.
Alandra, do you have any guesses, or do you concur?
No, I'm learning a lot right now.
Okay. All right. So those were all from one of our Rockin Pop-Up friends, and now we've got another submission that just came in today. So I'm going to do a new share for this one. Okay, so we're not looking at the coffee cup here. We're looking at what's next to the coffee cup. What do you guys see?
So I'll jump in here and just start by thinking about the textures here. to me, and again, always tricky with a picture. It's a lot easier if you can get your hands on it. But the texture of this rock looks a bit like a sandstone to me. And whenever we see funky shapes of sandstones, that's a cue, right, Gavin?
That's right, Graham. I mean, this looks like the rock version of an onion to me. It's like you have layers here, and so that's oftentimes when you get nodules in the sedimentary record, they look like that. It's like you have a pore space and you fill that pore space, or you grow around a sort of nucleation point over time, and you're constantly adding more sediment around a nucleation point. So you often get these in sedimentary rocks where you have a lot of pore spaces, or you have a lot of activity in terms of like water and stuff. So these can be coastal as well in terms of nodules. So, yeah.
And this one was found, I think, around Nicene Marks. And what I know about that area is that it's a lot of Purissima Formation sandstone. And what I know about the Purissima Formation is that it's full of concretions, right?
Right, yeah.
Well, that's one of our favorite Rockin Pop-Up finds are concretions. So maybe something like that. But yeah, these always stand out because they're these wonderful, perfectly round shaped rocks. They look so purposeful.
Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, and so for everyone joining us, you can always submit your favorite rock finds or things that you have questions about. You can send us an email to events@santacruzmuseum.org or put them in the Facebook event here. And I just wanted to note that our Rockin Pop-Ups are now once a month. So we're going to do them every first Wednesday of the month. So we'll see you again in October for the next Rockin Pop-Up. But in the meantime, next week we have a paleontology event through the museum. So if you're a museum member, you can join us to learn more about our paleontology collection next Thursday. So we hope you do that. And once again, Alandra, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a wonderful treasure to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. I really appreciated talking to you all.
Okay. All right, well, we'll see you all next month then. Okay.